All right. Just wait for a few more people to take their seats. Right. Good evening. My name is Andrew Morrell. I'm a professor here at the Graduate Centre, and it's my great pleasure this evening, on behalf of Susan Weber, our director, and the Majolica International Society, many of whom are in the audience tonight, to welcome tonight's speaker. Miranda Goodby is Senior Curator of Ceramics at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent. She's been there since 1995 and is in charge of the world's largest collection of Staffordshire ceramics and indeed of a major international collection. She studied formally history of design and visual culture at Staffordshire University and took the museum studies postgraduate diploma at Manchester University. And since then she's been the recipient of several awards, including the Dwight P. Lamnon Fellowship in Ceramics at Winterthur Museum and Library, a V&A Millennium Award, which allowed her to study at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and a British Council Fellowship that allowed her to go to Dresden to study the English holdings of the Dresden collection there. She's also taught widely and supervised theses at a number of universities, at Wolverhampton University and at Leicester, at De Montfort University and elsewhere. She's also published widely in international exhibition catalogues and periodicals, especially on Staffordshire ceramics, which is her particular research area. So most recently in 2015, her essay in the exhibition catalogue Museo Internazionale delle Ceramiche in Faenza, a commerce so active and so universal, the growth of the Staffordshire potteries from the 17th century onwards. And in 2014, with Claire Blakely, Drink and Be Merry, Tea, Temperance, Pubs and Pottery for the Northern Ceramic Society, which gives an idea of the social dimensions of ceramics in her work. In 2015, she was closely involved with the acquisition of the Minton Archive by the city of Stoke-on-Trent. And this was a very, very important acquisition by the city and very much part of its social and cultural heritage. And she's been investigating this archive ever since. And it is this and what it can reveal about Majolica and Minton Majolica production that is the subject of her talk tonight. So please welcome Miranda Goodby.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Can I just check that everybody can hear me clearly? Fabulous. It's wonderful to be here this evening. It's a few years since I was last in New York, and it's always a pleasure to be back, and particularly to be speaking to such a distinguished audience. Now, if I can just get the technology to work. Yes, there we go. As Andrew so kindly said, it was only last year that the Minton Archive was saved, and it's really been astonishing how much work has gone on with the archive in the last 12 months. There's so much more to do. It's a massive archive. It's one of the most important industrial archives in Britain, possibly in the world, certainly as it relates to the ceramic industry. And it's been inaccessible to researchers for several years now. I can't really talk about the whole of the archive this evening. We'd be here for weeks. But what I want to do tonight is just to look at how the Minton Archive ties with the ceramics collection that we have at the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent. We were founded in the 1830s, and the city of Stoke-on-Trent is made up of 6 towns. And it's a strange city in many respects, but it's a long, thin city. It's around about 12 miles long and about 3 miles wide. And if this works, there we go. So you go from Tunstall in the top to Burslem to Handley Green, as it was called, to Stoke, to Fenton, and down to Lane End or Longton. And those are the 6 towns which now make up the modern city of Stoke-on-Trent. And the reason that Stoke-on-Trent is where it is because of the geology. And the map on the far side is a geological map, and the black line that you see running down it is where the coal comes closest to the surface, virtually outcrops in certain places. And you can see that the 6 towns pretty closely follow the closeness of the availability of coal, because coal, up until the middle of the 20th century, was the main fuel for the pottery industry. And the statistics that are normally given is that you needed between 7 and 14 tonnes of coal for every tonne of clay to turn clay into pottery. So you stick close to the to the collieries. And this is what Stoke-on-Trent looked like in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. There were around about 1,000 bottle ovens. Each factory had more than one, and they would be fired on average once a week. And there were many coal mines, and you can see in the top left-hand corner how close the factory and the coal mine could be. Each of the 6 towns had its own museum, its own identity, and its own museum. And we're based in Hanley at the Potteries Museum, and the museums were all centralised after the Second World War into what is now the administrative centre of the modern city of Stoke-on-Trent, which is why we have such an amazing collection, because we have the contents of 6 separate museums all brought together. And a lot of the museums were supported by the local pottery manufacturers. Some of them were virtually funded as well as supported by them as well. So this is a view of a painting in our collection, which is by Henry Lark Pratt, who was an artist who worked for Minton's as a china decorator, but also did oil paintings. And this shows the Minton factory as it was around about 1840. Now, in the 1840s, the factory was pretty well established. Thomas Minton had started the company in 1793, the year that his son Herbert Minton was born. And it started off as quite a small factory, but by the middle of the 19th century was of a considerable size. And you can see here the bottle ovens, and this is all the Minton factory here. There's another little factory down here. And you can see that in the 1840s, Stoke-on-Trent, although industrialising quickly, was still very much a straggle of linear development surrounded by fields to either side. But this wasn't to remain the case. By another 50 years later, 1890, 1900, the Minton factory dominated the centre of the town of Stoke-on-Trent. The factory straddled both sides of the main road, and this gives you a sense of the facade and how intimidating it was. But when you got round the back, that's when you got a sense of the actual business end of the factory. And it was massive. The china works alone had 8 ovens and 12 enamel kilns. The earthenware works had 10 ovens and kilns. The tile works had 10 ovens. And in addition to that, there were sagger works and brickmaking works as well. And you can see a branch of the canal came right up into the factory itself. And it was a higgledy-piggledy development as the factory grew and grew. And the factory stayed on the same site from 1793 until 2002. Well, you know what it's like if you stay in a house for a certain length of time. You fill up the space, and you don't throw things away because it's easier to keep them than not. And that's exactly what happened with Minton, both with its collection of ceramics and particularly its archive. Why throw it away when you've got the space? There's always somewhere to put it, and it'll come in handy one day. By the middle of the 19th century, the Minton factory was probably the premier factory in Stoke-on-Trent. It had certainly overtaken Wedgwood, which was in a bit of a decline at this stage. And it had a great rivalry with the factory of Spode, who were just across the road. And this is a view of the Minton factory showroom as it was around about 1900. And there's a few pieces in there that you will see later on, the peacock and these 2 pieces in particular. And you get a sense of the magnificence by the way, virtually all of the photographs and archive materials I'm showing you are from the Minton Archive itself. And so this is just one of the photographs in the archive. And so this is the factory showroom as it was around about 1900, with exactly the sort of wares you would expect. Prestige wares, majolicas, bone chinas, exhibition pieces which have been brought back to the showroom and which were there to impress the buyers as they were visiting. But by the early part of the 20th century, the Minton factory itself was resting on its laurels. And let's just see. So that if you look at this view of the showroom as it was in 1933, well, if it wasn't for the fashions of the women in the pictures, it could have been 1900, really. They're not moving forward into Art Deco, they're not moving forward into modern, streamlined design. Instead, the centrepiece of the showroom is a majolica piece, and there are various other pieces around which are 20, 30 or more years old. However, just after the Second World War, the factory did demolish quite a large range of buildings and built a new main office, showroom and administrative centre. And as part of that, I'm glad to say, they built themselves a museum. And quite a few of the pieces which had been in the showroom were finally moved out and put into the museum, which was open to the public. It was quite a hard museum to find in a way, but it was a little jewellery box in its own right. And there were some magnificent pieces there. And that museum lasted until the very end of the 20th century. What was also available to consult, although not on display, was the archive. Now, these are modern photographs taken by the Art Fund, who helped save the archive. But it just gives you a sense of the richness that you have, whether it's ledgers and pattern books and shape books, artwork rolled up, loose sheets of designs. And these were all kept in a safe, with a massive metal door that you went into, quite terrifying. And it was a working archive. It was used by the factory as a design source, but it was also available for people to consult. And I can remember doing exactly that when I was an undergraduate student. And Joan Jones, the then curator, was incredibly kind to me. But unfortunately, it wasn't to last. The Minton factory, like so many factories, was taken over and became part of the Royal Doulton Group. And Royal Doulton, in turn, got into difficulties at the end of the 20th century and decided that it would sell off its assets. It sold off the Minton factory site and moved the archive and the collection off-site. And the rather smart post-war building was demolished, and as you can see, there's a supermarket on the site. The only thing that really links the two is the statue of Colin Minton Campbell, which remains. In the same year that the factory was demolished, the Minton Museum was sent for sale through Bonhams. Unlike the Wedgwood Museum, unlike our museum, it wasn't independently owned. It wasn't part of a trust. It was an asset of the company and therefore could be realised just as much as the office furniture or the buildings. And so it was sent for sale. It didn't do the company any good. They got into further problems and were eventually taken over by Waterford Wedgwood in 2005. At the Potteries Museum, we did try to buy the whole collection as it stood. Put together a bid, secured funding, and it was turned down by the company, who reckoned that they could get more for it by selling it off piecemeal. And they were absolutely right, because some of the pieces went for 10 times the estimate, which must have been a consolation to their accountants, but wasn't locally to the people of Stoke-on-Trent. However, we were able to buy a number of pieces with help of the Heritage Memorial Fund, and this is a view of the 19th century galleries at the Potteries Museum with the peacock and a selection of the pieces that we were able to buy: bone china, majolica, earthenwares, and of course the peacock itself. And designed by Paul Comolera in 1873. There's a number of them around the world, one in Philadelphia, there's at least 2 in Australia. This was the one that was in the Minton showroom, and when we got it, the little crest on the top was damaged and had to be repaired because at one point in its life it had stood at the bottom of the main stairs in the post-war building. And apparently the story is that after a particularly enjoyable Christmas party, somebody was sliding down the banister and kicked the peacock's crest off. However, it was mended. It's a marvellous example of Majolica ware. And this is the display within the museum where our Minton Majolica was concentrated. And the reason I wanted to concentrate on how the archive fits in with our collection is because of the pieces that we have from the Minton Museum, but also pieces that we have which were transferred to us in 1934 from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Anyway, Minton's got into further, well, Royal Dalton, who owned Minton, got into further trouble. We were taken over by Wedgwoods, as I say. They tried to sell the archive, but failed at that point because over the Christmas period of 2008, Waterford Wedgwood itself went into administration. They'd actually sent half of the archive down to Bonhams, ready for sale, just before Christmas. The company went into administration over the Christmas holidays and it was all put on hold. And from 2008 until 2015, the collection was inaccessible and nobody knew what was going to happen to it. 2008 was a bad year for the potteries because the Spode factory went into administration earlier that year, but their museum and archive were held by a trust, so it was quite safe. As you're probably aware, between 2008 and late 2014, there was a lot of work going on to secure the Wedgwood Museum collection and its archive. And whilst that was going on, we were all keeping very quiet about Minton because we didn't really want to mix the two up together. But at the end of 2014, the Wedgwood Museum and its archive were saved through the good offices of the Art Fund, a London-based charity whom I'm sure many of you know well. And a celebration was held at the end of 2014, and then in January 2015, my director at the Potteries Museum got a phone call from the Art Fund saying, "Could you pop down to London, perhaps tomorrow? We'd like to talk about the Minton archive now." So we were straight on a train the next day. And the Waterford Wedgwood Company wanted to sell the Minton archive, and they wanted to sell it by the end of March, as this was the January. Price had to be agreed, conditions, and the money raised. And the Art Fund was absolutely fabulous at this. They'd just got over raising all the money for the Wedgwood archive, and you'd have thought that people would have been exhausted with being asked for funding. And they went out and made, I think, about half a dozen phone calls, and the money was there. And then their lawyers and the Wedgwood lawyers entered a period of vigorous emailing and phoning, shall we say. But it was all sorted out right at the end of March, and then last year in April and May, the Minton archive was brought back from Bonhams and back from Wedgwoods, back into the city, and is now housed at the City Archives, which is next door to our museum. And I particularly like this photograph, which I took, which is a photograph of me taking a photograph of the assistant archivist, taking a photograph. There's actually, and one person who's a city archivist, Chris Latimer, actually doing any work. So the collection's all been brought back, and it's housed at the building you can see up there, which is City Archives, and which is the building next door to us, which is here. Now, the archive had been catalogued back in the 1970s, but over the years, various things had been moved, removed, photographed, put back in the wrong place, popped into boxes after being photographed because we'll integrate it back into the archive. And it is in a bit of a state. And I must confess that the first 3 documents that I called up when I had the printed catalogue in my hand from the 70s, and Chris and Louise Faraday, the archivists, were looking for them, the first 3 pieces we couldn't find. They're not where they should be. They're in the archive, they're just misfiled. So that's what the work is going to be over the next few years. Anyhow, it's there and it can be consulted. The archive is open Wednesday through till Saturday, and there is a website on which more material is being put every week, and I will give you the website details at the end. I would thoroughly recommend it to you. So what we did last year, once the archive was back, was we did a little display called Welcome Home, bringing out some of the pieces from our reserve collections and some of the catalogue items from the Minton Archive and putting them on display for people to really get a sense of the riches that it contains. Remember, nobody had seen this material since about 2007, really. So some pieces of bone china, front and back, and some patsia pat. And in the cases, we had the pottery, and then in cases without lighting, we had the archive material. And some of the pieces we blew up to be graphic panels as well. It was just a selection of pieces that we could tie into the archive quite easily. And then the archive material was changed over on a monthly basis as we went along. And it's being digitised, as I say, as an ongoing project. So, the Minton factory. The company itself was the dominant factory in the 19th century, and it was down to 3 men. 2 of them, members of the Minton family. Herbert Minton, who took on the factory after the death of his father in 1836, and who ran it until his own death in 1858. And his nephew, Colin Minton Campbell. Herbert Minton had no children of his own, and so he took his sister's son, Colin Minton Campbell, into partnership from 1844 onwards. And the 2 men ran the company for over 40 years. Herbert Minton was an amazing person, but left very few personal records. Fortunately, he was great friends with Henry Cole, who writes about him frequently in his diaries, Henry Cole of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And these 2 men were remarkable, but the third remarkable person in the story of Minton is Leon Arnoux. Born in 1816, he died in 1902. He was there throughout 3 and outlived 3 of the different owners of the Minton factory. He worked for the company from 1848 to 1892, and after he retired, he came back to act as an advisor to the firm when it got into financial difficulties in the 1890s. He was a partner in the firm from 1885 onwards after the death of Colin Minton Campbell, and he earned more than any other person in the potteries at that time who was involved in the pottery business. His annual salary was £1,200 with a bonus of £350. Nobody could afford to pay that much apart from Minton, and nobody could afford to poach him from Minton because they would have had to have topped that salary. This at a time, by the way, when a skilled worker was probably earning around about £1 a week, so around about £52 to £60 a year. You've got somebody who's earning over £1,500 a year. But he was worth it. And the title, The Man Who Made Mintons, was taken from his obituary in the local newspaper, for he was Minton's in all but name. And he was the man, of course, who introduced Majolica to the factory. Now, Majolica is a difficult thing to define, but for the purposes of this evening, I'm going to say the Victorian Majolica is essentially a buff-coloured earthenware body decorated with coloured glazes. And the Minton factory created a variety of wares under this general definition. Their Palissy wares, which they produced and marketed, where the important part was the moulding of the pieces and their decoration with coloured transparent lead glazes. And what they termed as their Majolica or modern Majolica, which again was moulded but was usually decorated with hand-painted designs in a Renaissance style. Leon Arnoux himself, writing in the 1870s, complained bitterly that customers would keep referring to it all as Majolica and not making the distinction between Palissy and Majolica wares. But one must assume that the customer is always right. For today, everybody refers to it as Majolica ware, and if you try to call it Palissy ware, one rather feels that the tide is against you. But Minton was originally taken on to improve the porcelain body at Leonardo was originally taken on to improve the porcelain body at Minton, but decided quite shortly after his arrival that the bone china body that the factory was using couldn't really be improved upon, and so switched his energies to improving the glazes and introducing a new range of earthenware bodies, of which Majolica was one. And Majolica, of course, was launched at the Great Exhibition in 1851. And two rather lovely images here, one showing visitors to the factory, and this one on the right, which is a coloured lithograph highlighting some of the pieces. And I'll just draw your attention to this design here, which you can see up here. Because this was where, I suppose we should be calling these Palissy wares, but Majolica wares in the Palissy taste were launched. And when you go to the archive and look in their shape books, their ornaments shape book, not for useful tablewares, you can see this exact model here, garden pot and stand, ram's head and festoon, shape number 727, and somebody has written in above it, in 1851 exhibition. And this is quite unusual in the shape book in that it's a photograph. Most of the designs in the shape book are beautifully hand-drawn, like this one. This is rather splendid. And garden pot passion flower shape 586, and if any of you are familiar with this one, you know it comes in the most amazing colours. And whilst these are beautiful drawings, you really have to try and use your imagination to think of them in all their glory. And this is down, as you can see, I hope, somewhere around about here. It says same price as ram's heads. And the ram's heads, which are the previous ones we were looking at, are here and go from 48 shillings down to, I think, about 24 shillings per item. So they're not cheap. They're a week's wages or 2 weeks' wages, depending on size. These are not designed for working classes. They're designed for the middling classes and above. These are expensive pieces. And this is taken from another document in the archive, which is the net prices for earthenware in 1854. Wonderful document, which will pay great study. As you can imagine, these pieces were an absolute hit at the Great Exhibition, and along with the other wares that the factory was showing there was one of the reasons for Minton's being given a bronze medal, a council medal. They were the only British company to get such an award, and this very sad little document was found in an envelope in the Minton archive and has been pieced together digitally. And you think that such an important piece would have been cared for. You can see it has been framed at some point, but then it was folded up, stuffed into an envelope, and it's just fallen apart with brittleness. There's a lot of conservation to be done with the Minton archive, it must be admitted. The Minton factory was remarkable. Not only did it have three hugely important people at its helm, Herbert Minton, Colin Minton Campbell and Leon Arnoux, but Herbert Minton in particular really believed in investing in design. He brought into the company many French, German, Italian, Austrian artists, firstly in 1848 and then again in the 1870s when Europe was in a state of flux. But he also supported the local artistic talent in the area. There was an art school in Stoke-on-Trent from the 1840s, and by 1849 it had over 130 students, 100 of them male students and between 25 to 30 female students, which was very unusual at the time. The only other art school in the area had only 5 female students and about 100 male students. And it was very much reported on that it was due to Herbert Minton's support that so many students were attending. And Colin Minton Campbell, when he gave evidence to a government's committee in the 1860s, said that they had supported the art school in Stoke-on-Trent to the tune of £100 a year up into the 1850s, and more recently £200 a year, in addition to paying the fees of many of the students, which was between another £60 to £70 a year. So they encouraged their workers to go to the schools of art. And they didn't just do that. Herbert Minton paid for an art teacher to visit the local schools in the area. most children in the Potteries at that point would have been going to work at around between 8 and 10, and education wasn't compulsory by any means, and you had to pay for it. But for those children that were going to school, Herbert Minton sent an art teacher to go to each school within walking distance 1 day a week and to teach drawing to those children, which was very kind of him, but it was carefully thought through as well, because when those children left at 10, they already had an idea of which ones were showing artistic talent. So he then knew which ones it was worth employing at the factory, and then they would be encouraged to go to the art school, and there they'd have their fees paid. And there they would receive a good art education, which would then feed back into the company itself. And he also encouraged many of the modellers and the artists at the factory to teach at the art school itself. So it became a circular system. You went as a student, you did well, then you taught, and you were bringing up the next generation. And by the middle of the 19th century, the Stoke-on-Trent Art School itself, a small art school, only 130 students, was winning more gold medals in national competitions than any other art school in England other than the South Kensington School itself. By 1858, the school had outgrown its present headquarters, and following the death of Herbert Minton, the Minton Memorial Building was put up, built in 1858 by subscription, and it comprised 3 wonderful things: a school of art, a savings bank, and a public baths. 3 subjects close to Herbert Minton's heart: health, frugality, and education. Who could argue with that? Of course, as a public bath, it wasn't a swimming bath, it was a public bath as well, where you could actually get a bath. In the 1870s, they'd completely outgrown that, and a new building was put up next door, and both these buildings, you'll be glad to know, still stand. And you can see the art school was on the top there, and the Stoke-on-Trent Museum, as was in that building, one that we left long ago, just too small for us. One person who often gets overlooked in the importance of the art school in Stoke-on-Trent is J.C. Robinson. He was headmaster at the Stoke School of Art between 48 and 52. And while he was there, Pierre-Emile Geneste, who was working at the Minton factory, was the teacher of sculpture and modelling. But when Robinson left after 4 years, he went to London, and he became the first curator of the Museum of Ornamental Art at Marlborough House, later the South Kensington Museum, and now, of course, the V&A. He was working for Henry Cole. Henry Cole and Herbert Minton were great friends. And one of the things that many of the students from the schools of art would do was that they would go down to London and they would draw from the pieces at the Victoria and Albert Museum under the support of Henry Cole and of Robinson. And then they would bring those designs back to Stoke-on-Trent. And again, you get this movement. You haven't just got Minton being a small provincial company. They're working down in London. They're sending their artists down to London to look at the collections that are on loan at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the new pieces that they're acquiring there. And in 1848, you get this lovely quotation from the Art Journal saying that the majority of the pupils at Stoke-on-Trent are modellers, while at Hanley they are engravers. And again, further on in the article, it goes on to say that around about a third of the students at the Stoke-on-Trent School of Art are engaged as modellers professionally. They're not just students, they're actually bringing that back into their work. And here's an example here from a piece in our collection which was designed by Hamlet Bourne. You can see just down there the artwork for it in the shape book. And Hamlet Bourne was one of Geneste's pupils, and he's working very much here in the Renaissance style, as you can see. Another 2 pages from the shape book. This is an ice stand that was shown at the Great Exhibition in 1851. There's a little pencil note to the top, and just down here, Palissy number 42, which was the how it was being marketed. And over here on the right-hand side, a flower holder, and the comment here that it was probably designed by Geneste again. And please note here where it's been scratched through. And it's a note there saying that the mould was destroyed in 1927. Something that we'll see again and again, I'm afraid. Having exhibited at the exhibition in 1851, Minton's really did a huge push on their Majolica wares at the 1855 Paris exhibition. And you can see the same flower holder there. But I'd just like to draw your attention to this particular piece here, which was the centrepiece of their display. A jardinière standing 7 foot in height. And we've got it at the museum. And it's one of our glories. And we've had it for quite a long time, actually. The Victoria and Albert Museum bought it from Minton following the 1855 exhibition as an example of good modern design in the Renaissance taste. By 1934, however, they decided it was an example of bad Victorian design and wanted to get rid of it. And with a number of other predominantly Majolica pieces, most of them very large, they decided the best thing to do was really to send them back where they'd come from. And so they approached the then curator at the Potteries Museum and said, would he like to take some of these pieces back if they were deaccessioned from the V&A? And he said, yes, please. And it's been with us ever since. And it's a splendid, splendid piece of work. These are just some details from it. Magnificent piece. It cost the V&A £150. I'm not sure how many dollars there were to the pound at that time. I think it was around about $4 to the pound. But again, working on the idea that a working man was getting around about £1 a week at this time, you're looking at 3 years' wages. It's a huge piece, beautifully painted. Don't know yet who the artist was, but I think we'll find it. In 1976, the V&A approached us and said very nicely, could they possibly borrow it back, please? Because they were doing an exhibition on Minton. I don't know if any of you saw it in 1976. And so it was taken down and displayed in what is now the restaurant at the V&A, which of course, as you know, is entirely tiled with Minton Majolica tiles. And looked rather splendid there, although frankly I don't approve of the pampas grasses sticking out of the top of it. I think they did a lot better in 1855. But a marvellous piece, and one of the centrepieces of our displays now. At the top right again, a headed billhead from the Minton factory, and they're highlighting there their earthenware, their bone china, their Majolica, and their tiles, amongst other wares, because Majolica tiles were a huge part of their output, which I'm not going to touch on tonight. But here we are with the piece back with us in 2006, just to give you a sense of scale. It really is a large piece. And I'd just draw your attention to the little vase at the top, which is a Bacchus vase, shape 604, again in the ornament book. But what the ornament book doesn't tell you is firstly the colours, secondly if there's any painted decoration, it's only interested in the shape, and thirdly it doesn't give you a sense of scale. Because once you know what the shape is and the design is, well, the piece can be scaled up or down accordingly. And so here we have a piece which, as you can see, is probably standing about 2 foot in height, 18 inches to 2 feet. And here's an example of it standing at around 4 feet in height. And again, this is from the Minton Museum and is in our collection. And you can see it here behind John Campbell in the 1933 Minton showroom. And it was John Campbell that pulled the firm round in the early part of the 20th century after it got into trouble. Fabulous rich glazes with these pieces. And this was what set the Majolica wares apart from the other lead glazed wares, because all the pottery industry glazed its wares with lead at this point, with very few exceptions. It was the standard glaze and had been since the 17th century. But what made Majolica glazes so important and so glossy and so limpid and the refractive quality so rich was the quantity of lead. Whether it was earthenware or it was bone china, the lead glaze would vary, and it would be between about 14 to 32% lead, the total of the mix of the glaze. With Majolica, it was between 40 and 60% of the glaze mix. You've got a wonderful, rich lead glass over the pot itself. Truly amazing colours. And of course, they then held the pigments incredibly well. A couple of the other pieces that the Victoria and Albert Museum deaccessioned. This architectural Majolica medallion, about 2 foot across, and this frieze. And seen on their own, they really don't look so amazing. But of course, they needed to be seen as part of a scheme. This is a water fountain at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I think they just regarded it as a fitting for some time because they didn't get around to accessioning it till 1996. But they'd acquired it just after the 55 exhibition. But seen as a scheme, Minton Majolica is amazing. I'm sure many of you have been to the restaurant at the Victoria and Albert Museum. But if you go into the silver galleries at the V&A, these were originally the ceramic galleries. And the columns and the windows were dressed with Majolica tiles. But what I'd like you to look at is this little piece here. Well, I say little piece, it stands about 5 foot tall. Because this is a piece that was shown, as you can see in this engraving of 1876. And it was one of the pieces that the V&A de-accessioned in 1934 and which came to us. We've got 2 of them, but we've only got 1 out on display because of space constraints. We've got the pedestal in the shapebook. But of course it doesn't give you the wonderful painted decoration. And we've got the vase that goes on the top of it, as well in the shapebook. The Azelio vase, shape number 788. And I thought, what a strange name. Because very often they're named after the artist or some of the local landowners, Sutherland, or the Victoria vase, something like that. I thought, Azelio. And then I realised that Mr. Robinson, who was the curator at the Marlborough House Museum, had started a collectors' club at the museum. And one of the patrons was the Marquis d'Azelio, who was the Sardinian minister in London at the time, and who was a collector, and some of whose wares were on loan to the Victoria and Albert Museum at the time. And I think this is a nod to one of the patrons, one of the early patrons of the South Kensington Museums. So this is the Azelio vase, and we know that this particular pair of vases and pedestals were painted by Thomas Kirkby. And we hadn't known that until 2 weeks ago when I was getting this lecture ready, which was really nice, because I was going through the Minton archive looking for slides, and I photographed this piece because it had got Thomas Kirkby's signature on it, and I thought it was worth bearing in mind. And I was putting the slides together, and I looked at this one again, and I thought, I've seen those dogs before. Because there's an awful lot of naked ladies in the Minton artwork, and quite a lot of naked gentlemen too. But there's very few dogs. And the pair to this vase has that scene of the dogs on it. So I looked at the other figures and then went back to the vase and thought, oh, there they are. So you've got Venus and Jove with his eagle and thunderbolt, and there they are. And of course the vase design has been spread out flat, but you can see all the grotesques there and the piece itself signed. And that was a really wonderful thing to know, because this particular pair of vases, as I say, given to us by the V&A in 1834, when I was working my way through other parts of the Minton archive, there they were. Minton display at the International Exhibition in London in 1862. So I ran back to the vases because they'd still got the V&A's original accession numbers on. 1863 was when they'd been accessioned. Wonderful. Absolutely delighted. And Thomas Kirkby, of course, was an incredibly important artist within the Minton factory. He doesn't get as much publicity or as much credit as many of the continental artists who were working at Minton, but he was a local boy. He was born about 3 miles away from the factory in the 1820s, and he was working for the firm from his late teens onwards. He originally started off by doing sort of Watteau and French-style designs on bone china, but adopted the Renaissance style very, very quickly, and went down to London. He was one of the many Minton artists who went down there, and he worked for the firm all his life until he retired in the 1880s, and he was the first curator of the Minton Museum and Archive, which possibly accounts for why there's quite a number of Minton, in the Minton Archive, there's quite a number of Kirkby signed artwork. But here we are. This is his piece, again in our collection, formerly in the Minton Museum on the top. And the piece in the V&A from which it's taken, part of the Bernal collection, which was acquired by the V&A in the mid-1850s. And Kirkby went down to copy it, and that's his artwork, which is signed 1860, which is rather splendid. And there are pages and pages of his artwork in the collection. I'll just give you another one, because this is rather splendid. And the inscription at the top says that this is the first Majolica design that was carried out and painted at the manufactory. And this piece is again just signed around here, Kirkby. And again, another piece in the Minton Archive in our collection. And here's another of his drawings. I'd like to know where the vase is that goes with this artwork. It's famous. And of course, these pieces were incredibly expensive to produce. And they weren't terribly commercially successful. And in fact, Herbert Minton's on record as saying that he made a loss with many of these very large pieces, but they were there to impress. And impress they did. This is the centrepiece of the London 1862 exhibition, with the waters perfumed by Messrs. Rimmel of London. So I hope those small children aren't going to drink it. And there's a photograph of the piece itself. And this was transferred to the Bethnal Green Museum and stood outside for many years until it was removed for a road widening scheme in the 1920s. The pieces are now lost, but I think they had been seriously affected by the frost and rain over the years. But that stood over 30 feet high. This is a piece, again, in our collection, dated 1882, but the shape itself was actually in production a lot earlier, because here you can see it worked into a gasolier that was shown at the 1862 exhibition. And you never know what you're going to find in the Minton Archive, because the box will simply say Majolica Designs, but you don't know what, and there might be 200 pages in there. And then you find this, which is lovely. And amongst the stereoscopic slides in the Minton Archive collection, there, somewhere, is the gasolier, the same one. So we've got the artwork for it and a photograph of it on display. And many of the shapes did continue in use for a considerable length of time. Shapes that we know were shown at the Great Exhibition were being produced 20, 30 years later. Here's the azalea vase on a piece dated 1884. And what they've done here is they've still got the Majolica glazes on the top and the bottom half, and then it's been painted in enamels in the middle. This piece, I regret to say, is not in our collection. It's in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, but we've got the artwork for it. And there's a fabulous example of it in the Victoria and Albert Museum, where the reliefs are, where the roundels rather are painted. This designed by Geneste in the early 1850s, and we've got the artwork for it in the collection. And this is particularly nice because it's not the artist's artwork. This is the artwork for the decorator. Because I don't know whether you can really see, but there's all these little numbers here. And in fact, there we go. And it tells you what colour glazes are to be used. And of course, that's the colour scheme. This is the one at the Fitzwilliam Museum. And you can see how, even with something which hasn't got painted decoration, the variety of glazes that are going onto it are really putting up the cost and the time in decorating this. This piece I thought was possibly a Puget design when I saw it in the collection. It looked like sort of Ascension lilies, but no, it's a Moorish tray. It says so in the shape book. And I know how much it went for. Moorish tray, shape 678, 12 and sixpence. And this would have been rather easier to decorate than the ewer, because the design is moulded into the piece itself, and so the outline of the design helps to restrain the colours. So it would have been almost a matter of just filling it in, like a paint by numbers scheme, if one can really ever say that about Minton. But it would have made it more affordable. As I say, this piece was 12 shillings and sixpence, considerably cheaper than many of the pieces that were being that were in the same pattern, in the same price book of 1854. And as you get into the 19th century, those Renaissance designs that Minton is so happy to promote and which give elegance and meaning to his displays of Majolica are not selling with the public. What is selling are the more brightly coloured, moulded glazed wares, such as this piece, designed in 1851. This piece is actually dated 1884. Brightly coloured. Really, all you're doing is painting over the moulded design with the different colours, and much more cheaply produced and much more successful with the market at the time. And there is a change. And these two wonderful pieces designed by John Henk in 1875, life-size umbrella stands. Absolutely amazing pieces. But Majolica sales by this stage had already peaked. At their height, between 1871 and 1872, the company sold £14,000 worth at wholesale prices of Majolica. But by the 1880s, the sales had declined dramatically, at least at Minton. But at this point, many other factories in Stoke-on-Trent and in America and on the continent were now starting to produce Majolica. They were producing wares which weren't as elegant, which weren't as well modelled and weren't as well coloured. It was becoming very popular, and Minton's wares were more expensive, and they decided gradually to phase them out. By 1894, at the Imperial Institute exhibition, only 6 pieces out of 108 of the Minton display were of Majolica, and 2 of those were peacocks, so it was hardly a new design. What did remain popular were pieces moulded in the form of fruits and flowers, the novelty wares, and of course tiles. Majolica tiles, incredibly popular all the way through. But even if Minton was starting to lose faith with their Majolica wares, they could still pull out all the stops occasionally. And this is one of the famous Thomas Good elephants, again photographed at the 1976 exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Designed in 1888, shown in Paris in 1889. The only 2 that were ever made. But, you know, the Minton factory had been on the same site for all these years, and they didn't throw very much away. And Eric Owen, and I found this when I was looking for something completely different in the Minton archive, said that when he joined Minton, there was an elephant mould 9 foot by 6 in the old mould chamber, and kids used to play hide and seek in it. I don't know when that was destroyed, but it was. And can you imagine the size of the mould for something to produce a piece this large? They had to take down the doorway to the kiln in which it was fired in order to get the sagger in, because once you've got your elephant made, you then put it into an earthenware box and to get it into the kiln. The logistics of doing that just doesn't bear thinking about. But it's still one of the great pieces of 19th century pottery. So, was it simply as a result of changing tastes, of undercutting by lesser firms? Was it simply that other wares were selling better, that Minton gradually decided to move away from producing Majolica? Well, it was to an extent, but not entirely. Things were changing. Here's a couple of pieces in the Palissy style. In fact, as you can see, it's the ink tray. I understand is a Palissy one. This is a dish that's about 2.5 feet in diameter. It can be scaled down for an ink stand, as you can see. Produced in the 1850s, still being pushed forward in the 1870s. And I've included this piece in the one that follows because they both come from the Arnoux family collection via Dr. Prendergast. Who was Dr. Prendergast? Dr. Prendergast was Leon Arnoux's son-in-law. Dr. Prendergast was medical officer at the local hospital. And Dr. Prendergast was particularly interested in the effect of lead poisoning. And he wrote a book on the subject, The Potter and Lead Poisoning, published in 1898. And I can't say that he was single-handedly responsible for getting rid of lead glazing in the industry, because he certainly wasn't. Many people have been agitating for it. But there's a strange irony that Arnoux brings in Majolica glazes in the 1840s. And 50 years later, his son-in-law is doing his darndest to make sure that they're going out again. A particularly lovely piece, this one, and hopefully, there we go, this wonderful piece here. Now, you see, the thing about lead poisoning is that everybody had known about it for a very long time. Everybody knew if you were a dipper, you were paid well, but your life expectancy was short. Especially if you were young, especially if you were careless, if you didn't wash your hands and change your clothes, because you were dipping your hands into liquid lead glaze, and you're dipping biscuit wares, and it would wear away the skin slightly, might make it bleed, and so you'd absorb it through the skin. The lead glaze would dry on your clothes, and you'd breathe it in. And there was hardly any factories had factory canteens or washing facilities, so when you ate your lunch, you ate the lead as well. And then you took it home on your clothes and poisoned the family. But you were quite well paid. Now, everybody knew this. Wedgwood had written a pamphlet in the 18th century assuring his customers that there was no danger to them whatsoever from lead glaze, and he was pretty much true. It was only for the workers. But in the 1890s, lead poisoning became a notifiable disease. And in 1895, the Act was extended to say that all cases of lead poisoning had to be notified to the authorities by the manufacturers and the doctors. Now, the manufacturers perhaps would have been inclined not to make a big fuss about it, but the doctors were paid 2 shillings and sixpence per case that they notified, which wasn't very much, but it was an incentive. And the following year, nationally, there were 1,030 cases of lead poisoning reported by medical gentlemen, and 432 of them were in the pottery industry. So over 1,000 across the country as a whole, and 432 in Stoke-on-Trent. Now, the majority of potters had nothing to do with lead. They were working at the clay end. They were moulding, they were throwing pots. The people that got lead poisoning were the glaze dippers, the people that brushed off the ware, brushing off the excess glaze, the glossed placers who took the ware with its dried lead glaze and put it into the saggers to go into the oven, and the majolica paintresses who are working with the lead glaze in all its wonderful colours and painting it on. And the problem with lead poisoning is it affects the young, and it affects women in particular, in that it affects their fertility, and it affects the unborn child. And so when you actually analysed who the 432 cases were, it was almost entirely gloss dippers and paintresses, majolica paintresses. In 1899, the law was changed so that there should be no more than 5% of a soluble lead glaze in soluble lead in the glaze, as opposed to using raw lead. And the potters were up in arms about this because lead was wonderful. It was cheap, it was reliable, it allowed all sorts of variations in the firing, and it would still come out working well. Other substitutes weren't so good. But the law had changed, and individual factories were being picked out for where the cases of lead poisoning were occurring. And this is a photograph that Andrew sent me a few weeks ago, and I thought I'm going to work it into this lecture, come what may. And factories had to pay attention. They had to supply workers who were dealing with lead with protective overalls, which they supplied and which they washed. And you can see the guys here in their white overalls. They're the ones working in lead. The chap in the centre with the bowler hat is the foreman. That's how you could tell a foreman in the pottery industry. He wore a bowler hat. And Mr. Morell is standing on the side, overseeing it all quite properly. And milk is being handed out to the workers because it was believed that milk coated the stomach and therefore prevented the absorption of lead. It did help a little, I suppose. Anyway, free milk's never a bad thing. What really finished off lead in the pottery industry was a combination of things. All of these things, plus the fact that in the 1920s, to add insult to injury as far as the manufacturers were concerned, they had to pay compensation to workers who could be shown to have contracted lead poisoning whilst in their employ. This was really hitting them where it hurt. There were fines, compensation to be paid, and publicly named and shamed. and lead gradually disappears. 1949, lead is outlawed from glazes in the pottery industry, and strange to say, from that date onwards, there's not been a single case of lead poisoning in the pottery industry. So, what you've got is an increasing awareness that lead is a bad thing and a change in fashions. But what you've also got is the fact that the Minton factory is in serious trouble. The year that Colin Minton Campbell died, their sales were over £132,000. They started to decline rapidly after his death. His son, John Fitzherbert Campbell, was not pushing the factory forward in the right direction. By 1900, they lost £16,000 in the year. They nearly closed. It was John Campbell, Minton Campbell's nephew, and Leonard New, who returned to work at the factory, who gradually pulled it round and got it back into profit again. But those non-profitable lines were cut, and they were cut dramatically. And one of them, of course, was Majolica. And you can see it in the shape books. Because as you go through it, in the 1920s, they have a complete rid out of all those shapes, which are Majolica shapes, which they are no longer going to be making. They strike through them, and they put the date when the mould is destroyed. This shape will never be made again, for the mould is gone. And they're all in May and July 1926. There's an example. These other shapes continue for some little while. And here's one of a piece, you can see it here, July 26. Written through again and again, even our monkey seat. Somebody's drawn a moustache on him rather rudely because he's completely out of fashion. And these magnificent pieces, no longer commercially possible, no longer financially possible, no longer technically possible because you can't use the same amount of lead in the glaze. And they go. But in the Minton archive, you'll also find all sorts of other things. This is a piece of ours, an exhibition piece. And then I found this, the Minton polka. Unfortunately, it's only the front cover, so if anybody knows where we can find the sheet music, I'd be delighted to know about it. But on the Minton polka, a whole variety of designs, including, hello, those little cupids again. That's the joy of the Minton archive. It's got all sorts of things in it. I can only just really rush through some of the pieces as it relates to what's in our collection at Stoke-on-Trent. But I would really recommend that you have a look at the website which has been set up and dedicated to it. Because when the Art Fund so generously raised the money to buy the Minton archive from the Wedgwood Company and then to donate it to the City of Stoke, they also assisted in raising money for an initial digitisation of the collection, and that means that two people have been working on it for 12 months, photographing it, sorting it out, listing it, not so much cataloguing, but listing it. Because when you've got a box that says Folio 1470, Majolica Designs, approx 200 pages, that's a lot of work. They're just putting in some grant applications now for a 5-year project to take it forward. But the website itself is called The Minton Archive. Do have a look at it. There's so much to explore in there. Every Friday they put up something new. There's a blog. You can search for it. Not everything, of course, has been indexed, has been digitised yet. But what you can do is you can go through and do a word search on it and see what's there. So, for example, I looked up Morel and found how much your grandfather was being paid in 1910. A photograph of his son at somebody else's retirement in the 1940s, and half a dozen other references, and you can do the same again. The archive itself is part of the City Archive in Stoke-on-Trent, and it's open Wednesday through to Saturday. They're really nice people there, so if you want to email them with any inquiries, do so. stoke.archives@stoke.gov.uk or via the link on the archive website. It's an ongoing project. There's wonderful stuff in there. I can only urge you, if you can get over to Stoke-on-Trent, to have a look through it yourself. Plan on spending the week and then coming back again subsequently. It is the most amazing collection, What we're learning about the pieces in our own collection next door at the museum from that is astonishing. But it's not just the designs, it's not just the pattern books, it's all the other material in there. There are apprenticeship records, there are wage books, there's the minutes of the social clubs. So there's details of the parcels that were being sent out by the Earthenware Division Social Club to members of the factory who were serving overseas during the Second World War as Christmas parcels. There's details of cricket matches that were being held between the China Division and the Earthenware Division, great rivals. There's all sorts of stuff in there, not just about the factory itself, but about the workers, their factory outings and photographs, marvellous, marvellous stuff. Watch that website, it's only going to get better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful insight into the archive. I'm going to be particularly interested in Googling my name and finding out about the family history. Thank you. Are there any questions at all? Susan?
Is there any indication in the records about how many pieces were made of a certain pattern?
Not as far as I'm aware. With the Wedgwood archives, what survives there are what were called the oven books, where they listed what was going into the ovens for particular firings and what came out. Very often it would fail. As far as I'm aware, there's no indication of oven books for the Minton factory that list that sort of information. It's very patchy. So you've got a great deal of detail in certain areas and other areas rather less. So I don't think that information survives, unfortunately.
I'm curious, besides the simple fact that sales accelerated for 20 or 30 years, and so therefore, you sold it, right? Did Herbert Minton ever try and clarify why people were attracted to the job?
Not as far as I'm aware. I think it was new, it was attractive, it was desirable, it was aspirational, and there was nothing else quite like it. And it's interesting how many factories jump on the bandwagon within a very short period. And it does sell quite well. The Renaissance painted stuff less so, it's true.
If you were going to, new, attractive, what was the third one?
Aspirational.
Aspirational? Clarify that for me a little more.
As to why Minton would have...
Do you mean aspirational?
Clarify aspirational.
So, is it the color? I mean, the
think so.
broader range of color and the richness?
It's-
Is it the fact that he brought in artists and
That I think is an
molded
important part.
things that were,
Yeah. I think that's an
let's say,
important part of
somewhat
it.
extraordinary?
I think that's an important part of it because he's bringing art into the potteries, and this is something that he makes a big feature of again and again, that it's not just local talent that he's using, he's bringing in internationally respected sculptors. And so therefore what you've got is affordable sculpture. You see it with Pavilion, which is an exact reproduction of contemporary and historical sculpture, but you've now got modern sculpture as well, by known artists, and it's new, but it's got a basis very often in historical revivalism, and it's got a novelty value. I think that's one of its great advantages. The colours in Majolica are unlike anything else that has been available before, and it just really is amazing. And there's a lot of new money about in Victorian England. That's what we've got to remember.
Yeah.
There's all these industrialists who are building wonderful houses and wanting to fill them with modern art. The Pre-Raphaelites are doing well, contemporary Victorian painters are doing well, and the Victorian potters are doing well, selling to those people who've got houses to fill, and they want what they've spent the money on to be seen by their visitors.
Along the lines of the aspirational thing, to what extent did Minton advertise? And in the archive, have you run across any advertising and where they tried to sell it as something very desirable and extremely highly rarefied and inspired by past culture, et cetera, as an indication that you were a very cultured person and knew, and you had very good taste, and et cetera. But did they advertise? I mean, in the archive, do you have any like advertising?
There's comparatively little advertising in the 19th century.
Pardon me?
There's comparatively little advertising in the middle of the 19th century. The trade exhibitions are their advertisements. The Great Exhibition of 1851, the 1862 exhibition, the 1855 exhibition. These are being reported in the Illustrated London News, which is affordable, everybody can see it. There are illustrations of what Minton are producing, what's being admired by the juries, the medals that they're winning. They're including that on their headed paper. Magazines like the Art Journal, the local newspapers, the regional and national newspapers, they're all picking up on what Minton are doing. The fact that they're winning international exhibitions, the fact that they are being given awards, that Arnoux is given the Order of Franz Joseph and the Légion d'honneur. These are all things which are helping to promote Minton in a period when you haven't really got a great deal of advertising going on. As you get into the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, then yes, you do see big advertising campaigns. Many of them are being pushed towards the wholesale trade, obviously, because a good wholesale customer is going to be worth a lot more to you than half a dozen retail customers. And so once you get magazines like the Pottery Gazette and Glass Trades Review and the China and Glass Journal, then you see Minton taking out big advertisements again and again. But it's the editorial as often as not which is really pushing the innovation and the newness and the desirability of the pieces. But those international exhibitions are being reported on at a level that you just wouldn't imagine for any trade fair these days.
My question is about source material. What were they looking at the school? Did they have, was there a large collection at the school to draw from that was, say, 16th, 17th century Italian faience or something like that? No.
But what you do find is that Minton is certainly sending students down to London regularly and paying their costs for them to go down there and to draw at the British Museum, and particularly the Victoria and Albert Museum. This comes up again and again, and it's all due to his connections with Robinson and with Henry Cole, and the two men are great friends. There are circulating collections that come out from the V&A to the provinces, and they come to Stoke-on-Trent. And Minton says in 1860, when he's at the government committee, how important this is, whether it's prints and drawings or it's actual objects that are coming up that people can see for themselves. There are, of course, books within the Minton archive itself which the company were buying, illustrated books which were then being used by the artists. They were also using Colin Minton Campbell and Herbert Minton's own collections of ceramics which were stored at the factory initially. They've both completely disappeared, unfortunately. There is a list of Herbert Minton's collection in the archive, and that's something I really would like to go back and look at and see if we can sort of track what happened to that and what might have been in it, because the description's fairly brief. And also what you find is that the artists themselves are, especially those designs which are drawing on nature, is that they're using whatever they can access. So the Duke of Sutherland, whose home was at Trentham Hall, just a couple of miles away, was giving permission for the Minton artist to go and draw from the flowers and the hothouses there. And in fact, there's a wonderful description, I think, of Paul Comolera when the Duke of Sutherland visits, asking if he can borrow a fawn from the Duke's estates because he kept deer. And in fact, later on goes on to model a life-size fawn, which was in the 1900 showroom. I don't know if anybody spotted it. And that was from the life. So there's all sorts of ways they're getting at stuff, but they are, where they can, drawing on those historical examples, either by visiting, by the touring exhibitions, or from prints.
This is really more funny, but I noticed in the very first showroom there looked to be a life-size terrier, like a Staffordshire Bull.
We all
Yeah.
missed it.
Yeah.
And there's one of a pug dog as well, which I didn't show you because it's not Majolica.
There's another one, Majolica, what's the big one? that,
Hound
The
dog.
hound,
Yeah.
they didn't do.
Yeah.
I also have another question. Wedgwood Fairyland, when did that start?
That's early 20th century.
Okay.
That's Daisy McCabe Jones is the designer of that.
Took a lot from Minton.
So
Was the inspiration taken from Majolica? No.
no, it's
It's
used on a bone china, fine earthenware body, and it's created with lustres and enamels.
Right.
So you get this very rich effect, but it's quite a different approach altogether.
Yeah.
With Majolica, it's coloured glazes or painting onto an opaque white lead glaze in this case.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Taking off on Susan's initial question about numbers of shapes produced, are there any, and thinking about really consumption patterns, so two different questions. One is, are there any records in the archive of the, let's call it the wholesalers, who took off large numbers of items every year, such that one can think about who then is at the retail end purchasing the items? That's one type of taste question. And the other would have to do with, in particular, minutes of meetings, company meetings. Are there any ways to track design history through the archives of meeting minutes?
Ooh. I don't think so, but there might be. I don't think there are, certainly for the 19th century. I think as you're getting into the 20th century, there's more formalisation of it. But what you find is that, as with so many archives, people have tended to save what seemed interesting to them, and sadly, the minutes of meetings are rarely regarded as being fascinating a few months after the event. They tend to get ditched. Whereas, as you all know, what's really interesting are the account books and the minute books, because that tells you how a factory is operating on a regular basis. So I don't know that there's any sort of meetings, minutes of meetings in that respect. And with regard to customers, there's certainly details of what they were supplying to Goods in the 1880s, Thomas Good & Co. And one of the things they're supplying a lot of are Majolica jugs and ewers for the bedroom. I mean, how rarely do those survive? But it's a large part of their trade with goods, alongside the garden seats and the vases and everything else. And sometimes it mentions the shapes, sometimes it mentions the artists, or they're available in different sizes. So you could probably take a slice of about 2 years for what they're supplying to Goods. There may be other stuff, I just haven't looked, to be honest. But I don't think it really survives in the way that one would wish it to, unfortunately.
Well, the cricket scores are there.
Well, yes, I know. As you get into the 20th century, there's a lot more peripheral stuff.
But I think your comment about the retailer Good, Thomas Good, is a great steer for his question. That if you debug that and the contents in the Minton archive related to that, there may be other retailers that are in there that you can extract their data from too.
And I think one of the things is that although the collection's been catalogued, it's not really been catalogued in great depth. It was catalogued over a period of a number of years, and the idea was to really draw it together, to divide it into sections and to list it. But there's a lot more work that can be done with the cataloguing. So you may get a reference to minutes, and it might yield a lot, or it may not. I opened up one folio which was supposed to be Majolica designs, and yes, there were Majolica designs in there, but there were a whole lot of designs there for the Victoria service that was shown at the Great Exhibition of 1851, and the artwork for the Galatea figure that was shown at the same exhibition, and that was in terracotta. What was that doing in that folio? You don't find it by opening the box.
So you may not know this from the archives, but I wonder if you can tell us, if there's anything you can tell us about union organisation or lack thereof at Minton.
Unions are a bit of a problem in Stoke-on-Trent. Firstly, unions were illegal up until quite late on, and then there's a huge strike in 1836 by the Potters' Union, where there's a lockout all across Stoke-on-Trent. The miners turn out, the potters turn out, They refuse to go back, and eventually, when they want to go back, they're locked out by the manufacturers, and this leads to a huge amount of bitterness and poverty, quite frankly, after being locked out in the winter months for 10 or 15 weeks. As a result of which, the unions didn't tend to be very strong in Stoke-on-Trent. And because the industry is so divided up by the different processes, is that you didn't tend to get a potters union as such. You would get the amalgamated flatware presses, but the hollowware presses might have an entirely different organisation. The crate makers would never have anything to do with the gilders because they were just miles apart. So you find it's very, very fractured, and it's only really at the end of the 19th century that it starts to come together. There's actually quite an interesting history of the Potters Union that was published in the 1970s that goes into a lot of detail about it. But certainly up until the end of the 19th century, there's not a great deal. Minton were quite lucky. They were a very paternalistic factory, and they didn't seem to be affected too badly by strikes or lockouts and stuff. What you also found was that in the potteries you would work for a year on a contract. I mean, it was a rolling contract, to be fair, but your wages would be fixed around about October time. And so any discussions about what your wages were going to be would take place in the autumn, and then they'd be fixed for a 12-month. And there are one or two references in there of the workers going to the management and saying, we don't like the rate you're paying for pressing so many cups. We think it ought to be raised slightly. But it was usually worked out almost on a workshop basis for much of the 19th century. But there is a bit of stuff in there, but not a lot.
Is there a reference to the American market and what they sold to the American market other than the English market with the good? Is there a major?
There doesn't seem to be.
Nothing.
And again, I think it's because a lot of the stuff relating to sales just wasn't retained within the archive for whatever reason. But then things keep turning up in private hands. And one of the things that's quite interesting about the archive is how much stuff was given in the 70s when the collection was being catalogued by former Minton workers who were saying, well, I've got some papers relating to my brother who used to work there or to my father. And they started to give photographs and archive material. And that's actually starting to happen again now that it's gone to the city archives. People are saying, oh, I've got, would you be interested? And of course, it's all grist to the mill of understanding the factory's history. But I don't think there's anything really there about the customers in great detail, unfortunately.
Have you come across the numbers of molds that gained new life when Majolica lead paint came into effect?
How many carried on in use, do you mean?
Well, what might have been produced by Minton in another substance, in a ceramic or a porcelain, and then they were used the same molds.
Often they were the same. So you get
same.
pieces that were in production in the 1820s and 1830s in a porcelain body are then reproduced in a Majolica body in the 1850s, and vice versa. So once you've got a good shape, if it's appropriate, you can produce it in another body. It'll come out a slightly different size because of shrinkage rates for different bodies in the kiln. But yes, you do see this, that a porcelain and earthenware figures are being produced in Majolica and vice versa.
One more question.
Well, we have several, so go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering stylistically if some of the problems in the 20s were that between Art Nouveau and the Vienna Secession and Deco, that because they weren't adapting to the modern age, they were being bypassed by the consumer. Is that
They were never really
silly to say that?
They struggled at the end of the 19th century because John Fitzherbert Campbell wasn't really interested in business. And so instead of directing it as his father and his uncle had done, he just let it slide. And you see this again and again in all industries, and you see it in the pottery industry a lot. The grandfather, the first generation has struggled to raise the company, the second generation benefit from it, the third, or in this instance, in his case, the fourth generation go, oh look, there's lots of money coming in, why should I get involved? It's just a cash cow. And that unfortunately was what happened. So instead of really pushing the company forward, he let it drift. He wanted to sell the company, but realised that nobody would buy it. And his cousin, John Campbell, brought Leon Arnoux back, and they sort of turned it around. They slimmed down what was being produced. They produced things in the Art Nouveau taste. Their Secessionist ware, which was a Majolica glazed ware, was a good seller. But lead glazes were becoming increasingly uncommercial and unproducible for all sorts of reasons. But a lot of what they sold was very traditional in style. They'd gone from in the middle of the 19th century, really pushing forward designs and being very, very innovatory, to by the early part of the 20th century, being a very safe house. And a lot of their stuff did sell in America. But what they were selling were pieces that were good quality, rather safe, rather staid designs that wouldn't go out of fashion, that wouldn't rock the boat, that spoke of the fact that they were expensive and well produced. Marvellous quality, but a little old-fashioned. But old-fashioned sells very often. You don't always want to be on the crest of the wave. And so when in 1929 they bring in Reginald Hager from outside of the area to become the art director, and he wants to introduce Art Deco, the company sort of goes, not too sure about this, and they water down what he wants to do so that it will still meet the approval of their standard wholesale customers who don't want Clarice Cliff. And they don't want bright Art Deco, they still want quality, they want expensive wares that you buy when you set up home and 25 years later are still going to be acceptable. And Hager goes with him 4 years because he can't shift the company round. And it's only just after the Second World War that they in fact eventually drop the earthenware side and concentrate on making bone china, because again that quality is what they've got a name for, in a slightly it's hard to put, but you know what you're getting with Minton. And it's a bit like Wedge. They're selling themselves by this stage on tradition, on quality. They're not selling themselves on novelty.